Hi there, welcome back. This is number 5, section 5 in the Apologetics series. I'm going to share the screen with you and we're going to continue looking at the Bible. So let me just bring up the screen I want here. And hopefully you can all see that. And I'll start here. So we've looked at the question, just to pop back a minute, we've looked at the question about the Bible and the question about whether there was written language at the time of Moses and how the discovery of this, a very famous piece of archaeology, showed the black stele of Hammurabi with the laws of Hammurabi in it, showed that there was certainly written language 3 centuries before Moses, and that there were sophisticated laws and social traditions in the cultures of that day, just as there were in Israel. So we looked at the key to ancient languages with using things like the Rosetta Stone, and there was another similar object found at another time. And so now we're going to ask this question: is the Bible genuine history? And we're going to start at the beginning and ask, what about Genesis? Of course, we're going right back to the beginning of the world, and we're going right back after the flood to the beginning of the cultures that we know of today from ancient history. Not a lot of those cultures, of the pre-flood cultures, would have survived. So what about the city of Sodom? There's various people in our society who would like to deny the reality of Sodom, and but we won't do that because the Bible refers to it, Jesus refers to it. And one of the things that archaeologists look for, they look for a number of things actually. One is jewelry, because jewelry had various fashions at various times. They look for coins, obviously, because if they were minted with the head of the ruler on, it gave a clue as to when those coins were from. They looked for clothing, though a lot of clothing didn't last, but in certain dry places, and even in certain damp conditions, like in England, where such things were preserved because of the nature of the soil, clothing is quite helpful. And of course, those things went in fashions: footwear, leather, things like that, tools, bits and pieces. But cemeteries are of particular interest to archaeologists because they give us so much information. A lot of people in those ancient days used to think that if they had things buried with them, they could use them in the next life. And so they had that stuff in their tombs. So we find a lot of stuff in cemeteries. The other thing is that the size of a cemetery is significant for an archaeologist, because it'll tell that person how many people lived in that area, how big the population was. So they found a place that some believe that was the ancient city of Sodom, and that one of the cities in the plain that was destroyed, as described in Genesis. It was the city wall was 23 feet thick, uniquely segmented. It's a gateway, towers, mud brick houses, and along the side a Canaanite temple, and outside there was an enormous cemetery with thousands of buried people. But one of the things that caught the archaeologists' attention was the way that the burning had happened. It was clear that this town had been destroyed by fire. The town site was covered by a layer of ash many feet thick, and the cemetery revealed ash deposits, charred posts and roof beams, and bricks that had turned red from the intense heat. So what caused the fire? Well, according to Randall Price, archaeologist Bryant Wood discovered the answer. So they cut what we call a balk, so that's a cross section, through that building as they were digging, so that they had a vertical cross section of that house and the destruction. This was a burial house, what they call a charnel house. And what they discovered was that this The fire started on the roof of the building. Then the roof burnt through, collapsed into the interior, and then the fire spread inside the building. And this was the case in many single charnel houses that they excavated. In other words, as the Bible teaches, that fire was poured down from above. It came from the sky, and some kind of volcanic eruption nearby, presumably. But they didn't just catch fire in the normal way. Then we ask the question about Noah and the flood, and that would be a whole study in itself. We need to remind ourselves that the flood was massive. That picture there is a fellow beside what's called a polystrate tree. And this is an evidence that the flood buried this stuff really, really quickly. The lack of erosion zones would be another evidence, because when things are laid down with sediments over long periods of time, you get erosion in between the laying down of the sediments. So that tree is fossilized straight up, which means it was buried in massive amounts of silt and mud, which through a natural concreting process becomes hardened rock, not immediately, it takes time. And so you can see there evidence for some sort of tremendous flood, and we see that sort of thing around the world, where it's clear that the stuff has been laid down quickly, not at one's hair's breadth per year, as some suggest. And the boat was a big boat, and we shouldn't be surprised at this. As I said, technology was pretty advanced in lots of places, and we were dealing with people not far from creation who had high intelligence, great abilities, and so the ark, the idea of the ark is quite acceptable. You know, the Romans used to build massive ships as well that could take thousands of soldiers to battle zones. And so huge ships are part of the ancient world, some of them very clever in their design. Another archaeological find of significance was the city of Ebla in 1964. As a child, I remember the excitement in the Christian community about Ebla. This was destroyed 250 BC. And Ebla showed, what was found in Ebla showed that they had written language 1,000 years before Moses. Elaborate judicial proceedings similar to the laws of Deuteronomy, and it supported the real existence of Sodom as a city, and it proves the Bible accuracy of Genesis 14 and that ancient culture. Remember, Abraham went through the palaver and the niceties of getting a guy to sell land in the cave of Machpelah so that he could bury Sarah, his wife, and have it as a family burial ground. So that ancient culture was real, and the Bible describes it as real. And then we have the Tower of Babel, of course, and I won't discuss the linguistic evidence of the reality of this, but I understand there is some, but I'm not an expert in that area by any means. So, but the Tower of Babel, it's interesting that in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who reigned, of course, a lot later than the Tower of Babel, but in that area, he placed an inscription on the portion of it, the rebuilt portion of the base of it, and he refers to it as the Tongue Tower, apparently. And he said, the first, which is the house of the earth's base, the most ancient monument of Babylon, I built and finished it. A former king built it, but he did not complete its head. Since a remote time, people had abandoned it without order expressing their words. Now, if this is true, if this translation is correct, it's fascinating. The oldest, most ancient monument of Babylon would most likely be the Tower of Babel, if it still existed. And that it had been built, but its head wasn't complete. Well, the Bible teaches in Genesis what happened to that when God destroyed it, basically, the top of it at least, and presumably only leaving the base. Without order expressing their words. I mean, it's called the Tower of Babel because of the babbling that happened and the way that God used this to separate people and send them off around the earth to do what he told them to do originally, fill the earth and not to sit around in one little place. Some skeptics in the past have said, oh, the Hittites, they didn't exist. They're just mythical people. A lot of the Bible's myth, they reckon, especially the ancient parts of the Bible. Now we have about 1,200 years of civilization recorded in Ankara, the capital of Turkey, in the museum there of Hittite civilization. And here's a pictograph of them, carving of them. It's fascinating because you get an idea of what these people looked like and how they dressed. What sort of garments their soldiers wore, what sort of hats they wear. And we'll see more of that. Obviously, there were fashions back in those times as well. So the evidence is there now in spite of the skeptics being proven false. And then this is the Hittite language. And interesting way they had of writing, characters and things. So that's from Carchemish in Syria. It's in the Hittite Museum at Ankara. These are the famous Hittite lion gates. And you can see them there. They don't look too much like lions now, but obviously they were originally. And that fellow on the left is Suppiluliuma II, the last known king of the Hittite Empire. Interesting how they wore those pointed hats. And so Hattusa was the capital of the Hittite Empire, and that's in modern Turkey. And that thing on the right, that's a peace treaty between the Egyptians and the Hittites. And Ramses II and Hattusili III, best known early written peace treaty, and presumably to keep the nations at peace. Another piece of important archaeological evidence were the Mari tablets, and they were found in the city of Nahor. And when Nahor is mentioned in Genesis, and they confirm the Hittite land buying, I understand. I said that was Genesis 14, it may be 23. Ephon answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord, the land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephon's terms, weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So there you have it, evidence that that part of the Bible, way back, book of Genesis, is in fact true. This is Neo, which means modern Sumerian seal, more modern, New Sumeria, depicting the events of Genesis. And you can see there a woman and a snake and a tree with fruit on it. And an ancient poem from Sumeria said apparently the maiden ate that which was forbidden. The maiden, the mother of sin, committed evil. So there we are, ladies. What about the patriarchs? What about Abraham and Isaac? Well, in Christianity today, some clever person said not one shred of direct archaeological evidence can be found for Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, or the 400 years the children of Israel sojourned in Egypt. There's some argument about the Egypt bit with some evidence of Joseph living there, but a response to that was the apparent lack of direct archaeological evidence shouldn't trouble us, according to Barry Betzel. Why should anyone expect to find the names of an obscure nomad and his descendants in the official archives of the rulers of Mesopotamia? Mesopotamia meaning between the rivers, presumably the Euphrates and the other one, Tigris. Abraham was actually quite a powerful, very, very powerful and successful farmer who had his own little army. So he might have been better known than this guy gives the impression of, but in the official royal archives, we need to remember that in these days, most people didn't write or read. And so written records were really mainly as a result of the initiative of kings who had scribes and people who could do this. So it's not like today where people write about everything frequently. Let's move on now to another big question. Can't deal with in detail, but a little bit. Did the flood of Noah happen? Was it a real flood? Was it just a local valley flood? Well, if it's just a local valley flood, why do you need an ark? Why do you need birds on board? Doesn't make any sense at all. The story really only hangs together if you believe in a worldwide catastrophe and a ship. Some say that this is the place where Noah's Ark rested. There's apparently been grid lines and things found in there, and I don't personally believe it. This is Durapina. I don't think that was the Ark at all, but it is an interesting structure. Some say it's on the Ahura Gorge in Mount Ararat, and that various plane pilots and that have seen it on times when the snow hasn't been so much. And it's claimed that this piece of timber was found at 14,000 feet. So, in which case that could be part of the Ark. And some think it's in Mount Judi Dagh in Turkey, the Ararat Mountains or whatever they are. And so there's various ideas. One of the fascinating things about the Ark is the ancient accounts in different cultures of the flood stories. So we'll look at some of those. We won't look at the scientific evidence really for the flood. It's there in the fossil record, but we can find out about these different ancient flood stories, and of course they point back to an original. There is some argument. Some people think the Babylonian story was first and the Bible story followed it. And I disagree with that. I believe the biblical story was first. That was the original. So you've got the biblical, the Babylonian, you've got Akkadian, the Sumerian one. These are the areas nearby where the Ark landed. This is the Gilgamesh epic from Babylon. And they called God Shamash. It was Shamash who set the time appointed, who sendeth the bane. On the previous evening will pour down the rain, then enter the vessel and close down thy doorway. For 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew and the flood and the storm swept the land. So that was their memory of this event. So there's a number of things in common with the Bible. Firstly, mankind was filled with violence. Atrahasis was a worshipper of Ea, meaning Noah, as we'd understand it. And it involves the same geographical area. He was commanded to build a ship. He used pitch to seal it. They could make pitch by boiling tree gum, I understand, in those days. They maybe had other ways of making it as well. He collected a variety of animals, and the rain lasted 6 days and 7 nights. Now, in the Bible account, it lasts for 40 days and 40 nights, which is more consistent with a worldwide flood. I mean, there are marine fossils on the top of Mount Everest, so we must recognise that during the flood, the mountain ranges were nowhere near as high, even if they existed, as they are today. And so the water's dispersed by the upheaval of land masses, dropping down of sea floors comparatively. And so we have land and we have water today. So the earth before flood, the flood would have been very different. I would have loved to have seen it. So they said 6 days and 6 nights. The flood was sent to punish wrongdoing. He sent out doves and a raven, and the last bird failed to return. Now that's a fascinating parallel with what we read in the book of Genesis. God promised never to send another flood. Atrahasis sacrifices to God, so lots of parallels there. The Akkadian account, Ea, the god is not Eo or this time, but Ea. And he tells Upnapishtim, their name for Noah, to tear down his house and build a boat, take up into it the seed of all living creatures. He loosed a dove, swallow, and a raven to look for land. And so it's one of a number of the different accounts from that particular area in Mesopotamia. Trahasis means exceedingly wise or devout. So there's more. There's the Greek version. There's the Athapascan Indians. There's the Papago Indians. There's the Mongolians. There's the Scandinavians, the Egyptians, the Peruvians, over 150, around that number in total, right around the world, all describing this event. And Noah's name has changed. In India, it's Manu. China, it's Fahe, or however you say that. In Egypt, it's Toth. In Mexico, it's Cox. In Hawaii, it was Nu, which is interesting, I think, because it seems quite close to Noah. In Sudan, it was Nor, which of course is very close to Noah. Sudan being North Africa. And Manetho, an Egyptian historian, talked about something that the Egyptian priests did in 250 years before Christ. And apparently they floated an ark. Oh, I beg your pardon, this is his account. That Toth went into the boat with his wife, 3 sons and their wives. So that lines up with Genesis. And he says, the Egyptian priests celebrated Toth's survival by launching a sacred ark on the sea on the 17th day of Atha, second month of their calendar. And if you have a look at Genesis 7:11, it lines up with that particular day from a biblical perspective. Interesting. According to the Sanskrit writings, and this is India, Manu became drunk and fell asleep naked. Charma, one of his 3 sons, who was not so charming, called his brothers to witness his shame. The other brothers covered their father's nakedness. So there's a story which apparently shows the reality of Genesis chapter 9. In the Greek mythology, Deucalion survives the flood in a chest. He's linked to the development of wine. Remember, in the Bible, Noah became a farmer and planted a vineyard, became drunk. So the development of wine apparently was known in the region of Urarta in the Samaria area. And an earthenware pot was found in the Meandoa plain containing a dark residue which turned out to be primitive wine sediment. Then over to the American continent, you've got the Aztecs flood story. Mankind was overwhelmed by a flood. Cox and Quetzalcoatl were saved in a little bark boat, and they landed on Culhuacan Mountain and repopulated the earth. The dove imparted languages to them, but they differed so much they couldn't understand one another. So you got a bit of a mixture of stories there. Not surprising. The more it gets told and the further it gets away from the source, the more things change. The Choctaw Indians, men were so corrupt, the Great Spirit destroyed them in a flood. 1 man was saved, the people ignored his warnings. He was told to build a raft of sassafras logs. A bird guided him to an island. The bird changed to a woman and they repopulated the earth. She was some chick, that one. And, pardon my humour. So Vietnam, the river swelled till the waters reached the sky. All living things perished except a brother and sister. They were saved on a large chest. They took with them a pair of every sort of animal. And I like the Aboriginal Australians. And their ancient story apparently is that the earliest time children ill-treated Dumby, the winking owl. So you're going to watch that if you ever see a winking owl. Be nice to it. And Naja, that was their name for God, the supreme being, drowned everyone. Gajara, that was Noah, got on a raft with his wife, their sons and their wives, along with food and wildlife. Many types of waters came, and I don't know what that means. And a kookaburra was sent out and found land. So there you are, that's a nice twist from local. culture. And Naja put a rainbow in the sky to say there will not be any more abnormally heavy rain. So interesting parallels around the world, assuming they've all been translated correctly. And these things point back to an original story. So there's another a thing called the Sumerian king list, which divides time into pre-flood and post-flood times. Pre-flood is officially called antediluvian, as in before the deluge, and post-diluvian. And the interesting, and a lot of archaeologists would suggest that they were mythical. Who knows? But interesting, they divide the names into these lists, and the ones that existed before the flood had much longer lifetimes than current ones, post-flood ones. And it's interesting, the Bible does say that God shortened the life of man pretty much to a maximum of 120. And it's interesting that even today, very rarely will anybody live beyond 120. So there you go. It talks about the Sumerian list. This list starts with the remote mythical past where the kingship had descended from heaven. The rulers in earlier dynasties are represented as reigning fantastically long periods. So they're assuming it's myth, but who knows? Some of these rulers, such as Etana, Lugal-Banda, and Gilgamesh, are mythical or legendary figures, known also from Sumerian and Babylonian literacy compositions. As the king list reaches historical rulers whose reigns are attested by their royal inscriptions, the length of each reign becomes more realistic. So they're saying that these may well have been real people, but that were remembered. But God shortened the age of the earth, but secular archaeologists wouldn't necessarily believe that. So there we go. That's from the Oxford University. Next question we're going to look at is the Exodus historical fact? People have said no. What evidence is for there? Did the people leave? Was there famines? Was Joseph real? And this is apparently the Hadramut tablet, from the Hadramut tablet, which is found in a fortress in what's today Yemen, found in the 1800s. So, we dwelt in this castle 7 years of good life, then came 7 barren and burnt up. When one evil year had passed, another away, and yet then another came to succeed it. What's he talking about? It sounds like famine that Joseph saved Egypt from. If this is correctly translated and real, it's quite significant. In thy name, O God, the God of Hamya, I Taja, the daughter of Josephah, sent my steward to Joseph. I sent my handmaid with a measure of silver to bring me back a measure of flour, and not being able to procure it, I sent her with a measure of gold, with a measure of pearls, and finding no profit in them, I'm shut up here. So this is a complaining lady, but it sounds like she was on the brink of starvation, so you can't really blame her. The price of slaves is interesting when you examine it. It lines up pretty well with the Bible and with history. Kenneth Kitchens, a famous Egyptologist, reckons that they match pretty well, remarkably well. Joseph is sold for 20 shekels of silver. It was the going rate in the region during the 18th and 19th centuries before Christ, according to the Mari tablets. By the 8th century, inflation had happened, and 8th century before Christ, the price had gone up 50 to 60 shekels. That's according to the ancient Assyrian records. And then it went up to 90 to 120 shekels during the Persian Empire in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. So, and in regard to Egypt, and this is Ramses II brick, that stamp has his name on it, his mark on it, and that was found with chopped straw in it, in the Nile. Remember, the Bible talks about how the Israelites had to make bricks, putting chopped straw into them for strength. Here's Merinth's writings, or still, this is the oldest evidence for Israel outside of the Bible. He was a son of Ramses II, and he writes this: Israel is smitten, her seed is no more. It wasn't true, of course, but then a lot of rulers kind of overestimated the value of their triumphs, their victories in those days. So you reckon he'd wiped out Israel? He wasn't right. So they were no longer in Israel, in Egypt, in the way they were. Anyway, it shows that Israel was around at the same time as ancient Egypt. A lot of people want to say the Jews had no right to the land. But this bit of archaeology tells us that they've been there for over 3,000 years. They were over 3,000 years ago, they were in that area. In fact, they were in Egypt, in Israel. There's a lady digging a well near a village, and she found the Hadramut, the Elamana letters, and these 400 pieces of cuneiform writing, or whatever it is. Excuse me. So clay tablets. The fascinating thing about these is that the one of them is the most famous one, I think, appears to be the land of Canaan asking for help from the Egyptians. So here's the part. The Habiru, presumably Hebrews, plunder all lands of the king. If archers are here this year, then the lands of the king, the Lord, will remain. But if the archers are not here, then the lands of the king, my Lord, are lost. Now remember that Egypt was kind of like a major empire in the whole area in those days. Later on, Babylon was. Later on, before Babylon, Assyria was. Later on, Babylon. And then the Medes and the Persians for quite a long time. And then the Romans. So these were the sort of governing, the major influence empires that ruled those whole areas. And so Egypt was maybe informally in control of the area of Israel as well. So the governor of Jerusalem is asking for help from Pharaoh Akhenaten. And I don't think he received it. So this seems to be the story of Joshua's conquest of the land. Some people said, the actual evidence concerning the Exodus resembles the evidence for a unicorn. Clever man. So is there any evidence? Nahum Sana makes the point. The Exodus story cannot possibly be fictional. No nation would be likely to invent for itself and faithfully transmit century after century an inglorious and inconvenient tradition of this nature unless it had an authentic core. So what's he saying? I mean, he goes on to say, well, Richard Friedman says, if you're making up history, it's that you were descended from gods and kings, not from slaves. And we shouldn't imagine that the Egyptians would really want to talk too much about it. Can you imagine it? A spokesman of Ramses the Great, Pharaoh of Pharaohs, supreme ruler of Egypt, son of Ra, before whom all the earth trembles in awe, blinded by his brilliance, today announced that the man Moses has destroyed the larger part of the Egyptian army. It's not the sort of things kings liked to announce. And it's interesting historically that Egypt had been the conquering power over the known world, and it lost its power around about that time. And you lose your army, you lose your power. That was the reality of the ancient world. Then we have Wadi Makateb, called the Valley of Writing on the Sinai Peninsula. And they found inscriptions there which detail events of the Exodus. The local Arabs apparently describe them as a lost language of unknown letters, and yet those letters are known. They are recorded from the 10th century, from 10th year before Christ, in Diodorus's Siculus's Library of History. Moreover, an altar is there built of hard stone and very old in years, bearing an inscription in ancient letters of an unknown tongue. So he wrote, it's an ancient report among the ichthyophagy, that's those who take in fish, who inhabit the shores of the Red Sea, that by a mighty reflux of the sea, which happened in former days, the whole Gulf became dry land until the water, by an extraordinary high tide, returned to its former channel. So that was the that was the record of it, the way they saw and understood it. Another fellow, a Byzantine Christian, reported the writings were ancient in his day. The engravings appeared at all resting places, all the stones in that region, which were broken off from the mountains, written with carved Hebrew characters. So there you go. This language had the influences of Hebrew. And he said they were made by the ancient Israelites fleeing Egypt. And it's been corroborated by others, these famous people interested in archaeology. And so it's a 22-letter combination of Egyptian and Hebrew, and it included 12 Hebrew letters. Remember, the Hebrews had been in Egypt for 400 years, so they had ended up with a bit of a mixed bag of a religion. The dominant language pattern's Egyptian, that you'd expect that if they've been there for 400 years. And apparently they didn't use any of the characteristic patterns of the language of Moses. Remember, Moses was educated in Egypt. So I don't know exactly the nature of this language, but it's pretty obviously where it came from. Often pictures of quail beside the writing. Well, that's no surprise, is it? When you've read Exodus. The wind blowing, the sea dividing into parts, they pass over. The Hebrews flee through the sea is turned to dry land. Their enemies weep for the dead, the virgins wailing, the sea flowing down overwhelmed them. The waters were let loose to flow again. That's presumably the destruction of the Egyptian army. People drink, winding on their way, drinking with prone mouth. Jehovah gives them drink again and again. People have drink to satiety, fullness. In crowds, they swell flesh, they strip from the bone, mangling it, replete with food. They are obstreperous, afflated, they cram themselves, clamoring they vomit. That's not very pleasant. But we do read where they pigged out on the quails when God first provided them. Tribes weeping for the dead cry aloud with downcast eyes. Talks about them bending the bow against them and snaring them. And here's another fascinating one. Miriam, prophetess of lying lips and deceitful tongue, she causes the tribes to conspire against the pillar and prince of the people. But if that's correctly translated and true, that's significant, because Miriam was Moses' sister and she did rebel. People said, give us proof like the Rosetta Stone, the bilingual inscription, so we can prove the translation. And in 1860, one was found which confirmed that Forster's translation of this graffiti was in fact correct. A trilingual transcription in a cave. This is what the locals apparently call the graveyard of the Jews. Kibroth Hatava, is it? Numerous engravings of quail in the cemetery. People given over to destruction cry aloud. Smitten with disease by God by means of feathered fowl, exceeding the bounds of moderation. Tomb is the end of life, to the sick, smitten with disease by God. And quail, according to Smith's Bible Dictionary, would be known to just immense numbers of them migrating that area of the world. Then there's a Shechem stone. It says in Joshua chapter 24, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel together at Shechem. He then took a large stone and set it up there under the oak tree in Yahweh's cemetery. Now the oak tree would be gone. We're talking a long, long time ago, nearly 4,000 years ago. But the stone's still there. And so this is just below the slopes of Mount Gerizim. They excavated the ancient city of Shechem. See there, I believe number 4 is the Shechem stone. There's Mount Gerizim in the background there. And remember the Samaritans lived in this area. Then you've got the Jabin tablet, which talks about the city of Hazor, destroyed by fire. And this is the equivalent of the biblical name of Jabin, referred to in Joshua 11, verses 10, as being killed by Joshua and the city burnt. You've got the Brooklyn Papyrus, which talks about Asher and Shipra, the names of 2 maids in an upper Egyptian household. So dated in the time of Sobi Turbit. Some of those pharaohs had dreadful names to say. And however, we mustn't change them. Maybe they had nicknames which were a lot shorter. This is the ancient city of Jericho. It's not very big. Cities often weren't in those days because they were just a fortress. Most people lived around and farmed the areas around. And then they came into the city that had thick walls when they needed to be protected, not unlike the Māori with their pas. So at the Jericho site, they found jars of grain. And one of the things that you didn't normally find in an archaeological discovery of a defeated city was jars of grain. I mean, the places were looted. The fact that jars of grain were found full is a sign that the city wasn't looted, not in the traditional way. It was destroyed by fire. And a thick layer of ash and debris about 1 meter thick over the city. The walls collapsed before the fire. Houses were left against a portion of the wall. They were still standing. And Rahab's house, of course, was in the wall. So, and it's been discovered how it happened. There was the lower city wall and the upper city wall, and the retaining wall there with an earth embankment. And the mud brick city walls collapsed, deposited at the base of the wall. There was earthquake activity. And bricks from the collapsed walls formed a ramp. So up and over they went. As it says, each Israelite went straight up and over the wall. Joshua 6:20. And apparently there's evidence of earthquake activity on the day the town met its end. This is some jewelry, scarabs, and a cemetery in the northwest of the city. And scarabs are interesting because they have the stamps of the pharaohs at the time. And so we know that these were from that time. This is from the city of Jericho. So it was still active in that time frame. All right, what about the kings? What about the period of the kings? Is it historical or legendary? Well, some said it was just full of error and lacking evidence. But then things were found. We know about the southern kingdom of Judah that lasted longer. The northern kingdom went off into Assyria, taken away and replaced by what people that became the Samaritans. The southern kingdom lasted longer, of Judah and Benjamin. And Was it just a fable? Did it happen? Is there a record of Hezekiah coming into contact with Sennacherib? Israel against the Assyrians? No match, surely. And then the Sennacherib prison was found. But as for Hezekiah the Jew, says Sennacherib, who did not bow in submission to my yoke, I besieged and conquered by stamping down earth ramps and then bringing up battering rams. Hezekiah himself I shut up like a cage in caged bird within Jerusalem, his royal city. So he didn't conquer Jerusalem, as he admits. And that's just confirmation of the Bible. This is what the Assyrians looked like. Interesting. Second Chronicles, then King Sennacherib of Assyria, while besieging the town of Lachish, sent officials to Jerusalem with a message for Hezekiah. And we know the story, it's in the Bible. There's a closer look at these soldiers. They certainly like their plaited beards and quite fashionable. This is the guy you can see there, prostrating himself, Jehu, before the Assyrian king. And Shalmaneser claims to have led Israel off to captivity in Assyria, which of course he did do. And so that just backs up history there from the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. And we have evidence from the Moabite stone. And he talks about the altar hearth of David. I dragged it before Chemosh, that was their god, at Quirioth. So Omri, king of Israel, oppressed Moab for many days. For Chemosh was angry with his land. So this isn't the Bible, this is the local ruler, the local culture there, the Moabites. This is Cyrus Cylinder. Then he pronounced the name of Cyrus, king of Anshan, declared him to become the ruler of all the world. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. So that's what Cyrus the Persian did. Ezra 6, shown to be true. Then you got the fall of Jerusalem, the one from the Bible, which we know about, and the one from the Babylonian version. King of his choice he appointed there, took its heavy tribute and carried it off to Babylon. Exactly what the Bible teaches. Times line up. And at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, gold chain put around his neck, proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So he was Belshazzar. Critics said no such king as Belshazzar. And the king at the time was Nabonidus, but look what the Nabonidus cylinder says when they found it in southern Iraq. May I, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, may I have my fill of life. As for Belshazzar, my firstborn son, my dear offering, grant that his days be long, O Shamash. So there you have it. There's Darius's decree in support of Israel. Critics say rubbish. No Persian king would acknowledge a Jewish deity, but we find from the Xanthos stone, discovered in 1973, a foundation charter for the worship of two gods, Persian god and the local Lycian god. Then there's a Siloam inscription which talks about the cutting through to the pool of Siloam to provide water to Jerusalem. And there's the story of the cutting through, swinging their axes, and heard the voice of a man calling his fellow. They struck through, axe against axe, water ran water from the spring to the pool for 1,200 cubits. You can go through today, if you're in Israel. Hezekiah's tunnel. This one here is 533 meters across at the bottom, of course. You'll get your feet wet, so be prepared for that. And I was in Israel, and unfortunately I didn't know about it. But there's Hezekiah's tunnel. What about David? Was he real or legendary? People said, oh, a bit like King Arthur. No literary criteria to say that he's more historical than Joshua. or Abraham or Adam. These skeptics, they get you down after a while. Then they discover that the way that Jerusalem was taken by Joab and David was lines up with archaeology. They found a inscription. The name, here it is. My father went up, my father died. He went to Israel, formerly in my father's land. And Hadad went in front of me, my king, and I slew of them and 2,000 horsemen, the king of Israel. And I slew the king of the house of David. So, thus the house of David was known throughout the region. Clearly validates the biblical description of a figure named David becoming the founder of the dynasty of the Judahite kings in Israel. So there we are. Another one, I killed Jehu, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaz, Jehu, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. I set their towns into ruins and turned their land into desolation. Then you've got the seals of Baruch, the seal of Asayahu, servant of King Josiah, and also that belonged to Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. So Baruch the scribe. And then you've got Nehemiah's wall, still there. A bit rough, but it did the job. And the evidence that that part of the Bible is true. We're going to stop this session now and move on, starting our next session, the question about the very, very important find, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what they tell us. So you'll be seeing me soon. God bless you, and I hope you've been encouraged by some of this evidence that I've been sharing.